The last category of irregular verbs in the past tense in Spanish is the category I call miscellaneous, meaning that there are verbs that irregularly change their form in the past and that there aren't any other verbs that replicate their form, like the verb caber, meaning to fit. Rather than following the pattern of verbs ending in er, as far as I know, caber is the only verb that follows the cup pattern. Yo cupe, I fit, tu cupiste, you fit, and so on. I recommend knowing this verb rather than using it. Next up, there is the verb poder, which is the only verb that has the pud pattern in the past. Yo pude, I could, tu pudiste, you could, and so on. I recommend knowing all pronouns except vosotros because poder is a very useful verb in the past tense, but one important rule to remember with poder in the past simple is that it's only used for actions that happened in the past and that stayed in the past. It's significant to not confuse it with a phrase like I could have plus an infinitive because this would be the past participle in Spanish, which is a topic for a future video. Instead, you can use poder in the past simple by saying something like Yo pude hablar con él. I could speak with him. Or maybe tú pudiste ir a la fiesta. You could go to the party. Of course, it's up to you to say any sentence that you want with poder. After poder, there's the verb saber, which is the only verb that uses an sup pattern. Yo supe means I knew, tú supiste means you knew, and so on. Don't focus on these pronouns because they're not that useful in conversation. One thing to note with saber in the past simple is that it's used in context when it comes down to knowing something factually, but not necessarily something that you knew how to do. In the present, saber is used for the following applications, but in the past simple tense, it's used to know something factual, like saying, Yo supe quién ganó el juego. I knew who won the game. And in the sentence, I use saber in the past by factually knowing who won the game, along with using a regular AR verb for the he, she pronoun. Of course, it's up to you to say any sentence that you want with saber. After saber, there's the verb querer, which is the only verb that uses a quis pattern. Yo quise is I wanted, tú quisiste is you wanted, and so on. Don't focus on these pronouns because they're not that useful in conversation. One thing to note with querer is that it's used in the past simple for things that you wanted in the past and that stayed in the past, like saying, Yo quise jugar contigo. I wanted to play with you, which is an action that I wanted to do and I no longer want to do it. I can also say something like, Ella quiso abrir la puerta. She wanted to open the door, because it's an action that stayed in the past, meaning that she no longer wants to do it. At last, in the miscellaneous category, there are the verbs ver and dar, and the easiest way to remember them in the past simple tense is that they literally share the same ending for all pronouns, aside from the first letter of every conjugation. Yo vi, I saw. Yo di, I gave. Tu viste, you saw. Tu diste, you gave, and so on. I recommend focusing on all pronouns except vosotros because they're useful in conversation. Try some examples on your own. Yo te vi en la fiesta means I saw you at the party. Tu viste mi madre en la casa means you saw my mother in the house. Él vio como yo hice mi tarea means he saw how I did my homework. Yo te di mi lápiz means I gave you my pencil. Él nos dio el pase means he gave us the pass. These are just some of the examples that you can make with ver and dar in the past simple, and as always, you can say any sentence you want using ver and dar. Now, we get to the category of stem-changing verbs in the past simple. The very first thing that I suggest to all of you is to remember that basically all of these stem-changing verbs will only apply their stem-changing rule for the él and ellos pronouns. All of these verbs are regular verbs that follow normal conjugation patterns across their pronouns, except for él and ellos. So just remember that. The second thing I'll say is that I won't give any examples with any of the following verbs because these are stem-changing verbs that you should know more than use, considering that the only useful way to utilize them is through the él and ellos pronouns. Taking a verb like sugerir, for instance, it's a stem-changing verb that falls into the to e category, and it follows the normal conjugation pattern of verbs ending in ir, except for él and ellos. Instead of using the stem beginning with sugerir decides to use e instead, and at the most, it's a verb that's more useful to know than to utilize. Generally, the same concept applies to the rest of the verbs that I'm about to list, going from to e, like mentir, which means to lie, preferir, which means to prefer, seguir, meaning to follow, conseguir, meaning to get, repetir, meaning to repeat, servir, meaning to serve, and pedir, meaning to ask for. All of these verbs are useful to know rather than to use, and the only thing you should know about them is that they change their stems from to e only in the él and ellos pronouns in the past simple tense. Next up, there are stem-changing verbs going from o to u, and as far as I know, there are are only two of them in Spanish, and these are dormir and morir, meaning to sleep and to die. Dormir follows the normal pattern of IR verbs, but only changes its stem in the él and ellos pronouns, meaning él durmió, he slept, and ellos durmieron, they slept. And the same concept applies to the verb morir. Él murió is he died, and ellos murieron is they died. As always, these verbs are more useful to know than to use. The last category of stem-changing verbs are verbs that have the letter Y and also include accents in most of their pronouns in order to maintain the sound after having two vowels right next to each other. These can be verbs like creer, leer, and oír. And as you can see, they are the only verbs in Spanish that have two vowels right next to each other, so Spanish decides to put accents on some of their pronouns in the past simple in order to maintain their sound. The easiest way to memorize them is to remember that they all share the same ending but different letters in the beginning. Yo creí is I believed, yo leí is I read, and yo oí is I heard. Tú creíste is you believed, tú leíste is you read, and tú oíste is you heard, and so on. As always, it's useful to know these verbs rather than to use them. And now, we made it to the final category of irregular verbs in Spanish, which I think is the easiest, and that is irregular verbs that are only irregular in the yo pronoun in the past simple. Actually, there are three types of them in Spanish, known as verbs that end in car, gar, or tzar. And since there's no point in knowing all verbs in Spanish, I'll show one useful verb from each category. At first, there are the verbs ending in car, like practicar, and while this verb follows the normal conjugation pattern for AR verbs in the past simple, it's only irregular in the yo pronoun, ending in que, meaning yo practiqué, which is I practiced. In case you see any other verb ending in car and you want to use it in the yo pronoun in the past, remember to simply change it to que. Next up, there are verbs ending in gar, like jugar, and while this verb follows the normal conjugation in the past simple, it's irregular in the yo pronoun, ending in ge, meaning yo jugué, which is I played. In case you see any other verb ending in gar and you want to use it in the yo pronoun in the past, remember to simply change it to ge. At last, there are verbs ending in zar, like organizar, which also maintain the normal conjugation pattern in the past simple, while its yo pronoun is irregular, ending in se, meaning yo organicé, which is I organized. As always, in case you see any other verb ending in zar and you want to use it in the yo pronoun in the past, remember to simply change it to se. And this is where all types of irregular verbs in the past tense in Spanish come to an end. Throughout both of these videos, I demonstrated all types of irregular verbs in Spanish in the past tense in order for all of you to understand what are their types, how to use them, and when to use them. Of course, knowing all verbs in Spanish is impossible and potentially useless, so I decided to exploit the most useful ones and put them in two videos so that you don't have to look up any of them, and they're almost all in these videos. In case you didn't remember them or forgot some of them, you can always go back and find them within the videos, not to mention that you probably don't need all of them. The point of this idea was to provide a guide to all types of irregular verbs in the past tense in Spanish to understand how to use them when you want to. And like I always like to say, some concepts are more useful to know than to use, and this video summarizes all of it in a nutshell. This has been all types of irregular verbs in the past tense in Spanish. Thank you for watching, and hopefully I made your learning just a bit simpler.